No, thank you all so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. As Dio said, I was in this room a little over 10 years ago for many such talks, so it means a lot to be doing it here. Thank you for having me. As she also mentioned, I am a journalist and I'm also Brazilian. I've had a sporadic relationship with Brazil my whole life. I've been going back and forth. I was born there, my parents are Brazilian, but we lived in the Middle East, Europe, and a couple different places. So Brazil has been a place that is my country and passport. It's my country in terms of my family, but I have not always lived there. It's a country that I've followed, like many of you perhaps, on the news and at a distance. And I was here in San Francisco working for the Associated Press and following Brazil as I always had in 2008, 2009. And I noticed, and again following not just as a Brazilian but as a journalist as well, and around that time I noticed that there was something different happening with Brazil. The way that the country was seen, the way the country was represented was changing. And you know, there were things like this Economist cover. The economy was booming. Jumping around. There was a huge oil discovery off Rio's coast. There was a growth of the middle class that was talked about here in California in terms of California's worth of people moving from poverty into the middle class. There were substantial changes that were being noticed not only within Brazil but abroad, and this is when the journalist in me started to think, you know, this is something interesting. This is something that I would want to look into, and I'll read a little piece for you. I'm trying to, by the way, mix photos to make it interesting for you with reading, so bear with me as I try to bounce around. This is the writer's version of like crazy techie multi-platform, you know. So I'm going to read to you a little piece about the moment when I was in the San Francisco office of the Associated Press, and it really clicked that something interesting was happening in Brazil that was worthy of greater scrutiny. I watched as in Copenhagen the camera panned to Brazil's president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, a stocky man pumping a few more hands in the moments before the cities made final presentations to the International Olympic Committee. Brazilians affectionately shortened his name to Lula as if he were one of the family. Being chosen to host the Olympics would give Brazil crafted during his tenure, an unprecedented vote of confidence, a gold star to show that this forever emerging nation had finally arrived. The International Olympic Committee had played that role before. Tokyo won the 1964 bid as Japan rose from the devastation of World War II. Seoul hosted the 1988 Games just when Korea was taking off. And China got the 2008 Olympics right as it was flexing its muscle on the international stage. In the week leading up to the IOC decision, there had been a scrum of press conferences with presidents and campaign trail stunts, making the run-up feel like something between a high school popularity contest and a political summit. The Madrid team flew in a liveried plane. Oprah Winfrey shilled for Chicago. Still, as the Olympic Committee members gathered, there was no clear favorite. Tokyo was a safe, functional alternative. Madrid already had most of the venues built. In a last-minute twist, Obama said he would deliver the U.S. pitch, becoming the first American president to address the IOC. Sorry, I forgot to tell you, this moment was the moment when the IOC was deciding who was going to host the 2016 Olympics. His perfectly timed trip swayed the bookmakers. On the day of the vote, the money was on Chicago. Whichever country won, it would face scrutiny and tremendous expense. The Beijing Olympics the year before had cost an astounding $40 billion, removed 1.5 million people from their homes, and left behind empty stadiums. The torch relay had sparked huge protests over China's human rights record. I had helped cover the marches in San Francisco. Spain and the United States were mired in a global recession. Japan's economy was faltering, and yet the contest was more intense than ever. Staging the world's biggest sports bash was expensive, but voters loved it. It also gave the host country tremendous leverage to promote a particular agenda, whether it was fostering rapid urban renewal, picking up a lackluster economy, or showing off new political and economic might. The problems with Rio were obvious even from afar. Security came first, then transportation with old airports and roadways that flooded with every major storm and gridlocked hopelessly every rush hour. There were not enough hotel rooms for the millions of expected visitors, and the proposal to stash them in dilapidated port area made the whole plan seem rather improvised. Official estimates said that preparing the city would cost more than $11 billion. That was 3 times more than the second most expensive proposal that year from Madrid. But the Olympics had never been held in South America, and Brazil's Lula had thrown himself into the campaign. He visited London's Olympic Park and spoke of the topic over months, making it clear that Rio's bid was the nation's bid, with support and funding from the top. There had been protests in Chicago where residents worried about hosting the Games would mean budget overruns, corruption, or neighborhoods race to make way for Olympic projects. Brazilians, on the other hand, were eager to host, Lula said. I'll stop here and talk a little bit about I'm sorry. I am going to keep reading a little bit because it makes sense with the next pictures. The president's personal magnetism made him a powerful salesman for Grand Brazil, but his life story spoke more eloquently for the country than any of his speeches. In his well-cut suit, he represented something unheard of in Brazil's history, a rise from abject poverty to absolute power. He had set his meaty shoulders against the odds, his birth in the parched Northeast, a childhood shining shoes and selling peanuts on the streets, his years as a steel worker and then a union leader in the country's industrial guts, and he'd made it. This was startling in a country of entrenched hierarchies, in which one's niche in society was determined by complex calculus involving class, race, geography, and income. By those measures, Lula should have never left the factory floor. And yet, there he was, an equal among presidents of some of the most powerful countries in the world. After coming up through the labor movement, he helped found the Workers' Party, which defended the rights of the poor and working classes. He ran for president 3 times and lost. By his 4th run in 2002, he trimmed the bushy revolutionary beard. The ink-black hair that crowded his brow had softened into gray and lay back in brushed waves. His suits no longer looked borrowed, tight in the wrong places. He took on a businessman as a running mate, reassuring the upper classes and foreign investors that his radical days were over. This time he won. 4 years later, with a stable economy and a broadening middle class, he won again. This was the Lula that went to Copenhagen, a man who drew on his rank-and-file background to charm, with an informal, backslapping manner that could sometimes startle heads of state, but was cordial, disarming, and very, very Brazilian. The country he promoted was a profitable place to invest, a growing power, a real democracy in which men like him could become president. None of this was lost on the International Olympic Committee that October as he sat, dark jacket, gray beard, waiting. After the informal greetings and handshakes, the candidate city's presentation started. Chicago was the first to make its case. Michelle Obama in yellow with big TV hair. I was born and raised on Chicago's South Side. She talked about family and about her dad, who taught her to throw a mean right hook. Barack picked it up from there. He wanted to welcome the world into my neighborhood. It was the Obama two-step, graceful, polished. They did it well. Chicago looked like a winner. Tokyo was up next, with something about green games. I went back to my desk, to healthcare reform and my deadline, all but giving up on Rio and after the Chicago performance. Then there was the drumming again. There had been these images of the beach presented earlier, Brazilians preparing for the announcement on Copacabana. Then there was the drumming again, louder. I looked up. There was the beach at Copacabana, the swarming crowd, the Olympic anthem floating over the masses. There was IOC President Jack Rogue on the podium, lean, staid, aristocratic, so European. There was Lula on the front row of the auditorium, fidgeting and crossing himself for good luck. Joseph Blatter, president of FIFA, the world governing body of soccer, and one of the IOC's voting members, sat across from the Brazilian president, watching him. Blatter poked the other IOC delegates, mimicking Lula's superstitious gesture, shook his head, cracked a grin as if to say, "Can you believe this guy?" Rogue thanked the candidate cities. He lifted an envelope with the 5 rings. He fumbled and pulled out a card. Rio de Janeiro, he said, stumbling on the hard Portuguese J and giving it the soft, aspirated Spanish sound. Rio de Janeiro. And this is my next, sorry, let me see if I can bring my computer to life. My next picture. there. No matter. Lula, Pelé, the whole Brazil contingent jumped from their chairs and fell into each other's arms as if they had just scored the winning goal of the World Cup final. They cried, they kissed, they bounced around like popcorn. Someone started singing Cidade Maravilhosa, and Lula led the chorus of Rio's informal anthem, belting out, along with the Brazilians in the room, his love for the marvelous city of 1,000 graces, the heart of my Brazil. Protocol was in shreds. IOC President Rogue looked uncomfortable. But Lula was unstoppable. He now wore the flag like a cape, an unlikely superhero from the global south. Photographers went in for the shot, and flashes of light brightened Lula's way as the security guards huddled around and pushed him through the crowd. The cameras cut back to Copacabana. The air quickened with flags and flying confetti, with fireworks. CNN's Shasta Darlington, reporting from the beach, tried to talk over the racket. She described a party expected to last all night. Watching the Rocosa celebration on TV, I knew the exhilaration was fueled by much more than the summer games. Brazil was on the brink of something exceptional. Other countries suffered through bloody battles for independence, civil wars, revolutions, the sort of historical junctures that can reconfigure a nation's character. Brazil had experienced few great ruptures. Independence was granted without a fight. There was no upheaval to end slavery, no communist insurrection. The scaffolding that propped its wealthy and powerful had never been challenged. These structures lay like bones under the surface, hardening over centuries, shaping Brazil into one of the most unequal countries in the world. Now powerful and overlapping circumstances, local and international, social, political, and economic, were forcing those old bones to shift and perhaps settle into new configurations. For the first time in generations, possibly ever, there was money and political will for change. The possibilities were tantalizing. Lula himself was the symbol of this potential. He'd lost a finger at 18, crushed in a lathe during a late-night shift at a steel mill. When he used his hands to make a point, which was often, there it was, a reminder of how far he'd come. The man himself embodied this moment when everything seemed possible. That's what the crowd on the beach was celebrating. It was Brazil's turn. The Olympics in Rio would give it a stage and a spotlight. This is when it struck me. It was time to go home. And then I'm going to read another little piece because clearly these are very large questions. These are very large expectations. Brazil had been a country marked by inequality historically. We were talking about tremendous transformations, political, economic, social. We were talking about money. We were talking about political participation for Brazil on the international stage. And I had real questions about how much of this was just unbridled optimism and how much of this was reality. It was, again, as a journalist, these are some of the questions I was starting to ask. So I'm going to read another little piece about that, and then I'll go into more of what I found once I got there. But what did all this mean? From afar, the whole thing seemed to veer between a well-founded optimism and a giddy, sky's-the-limit euphoria. Good news came in daily and by the handful. For the first time in generations, there was money and political will to push through substantial reforms. The World Cup and the Olympics gave Brazil, and Rio in particular, concrete deadlines and a long to-do list. Social and economic change was transforming the landscape and the expectations of the population. This was a unique experiment. The results mattered, not just to me as a Brazilian, but to me as a reporter. Urban chaos, poverty, pollution, and an indifferent government were not exclusive to Rio. Other megacities in the developing world faced the same challenges. Would Rio find original answers within the high-pressure crucible of the next few years, or would it crack in unforeseen ways? There's a Brazilian expression for something that's only a facade, para inglês ver, or for the English to see. It comes from the years after England abolished the slavery and campaigned to end the human trade. Brazil signed an international treaty and passed a law promising to stop, but the traffic continued. The laws were meant for the English to see, a nicety for foreign eyes. Would the changes of the next few years be just para inglês ver, or were we looking at a transformation that would go to the core, reforming the violence and inequality that historically hobbled the city? Whatever the case, I didn't want to just read about it in the news. I applied to be the Associated Press's Rio de Janeiro correspondent and got the job. Within 3 weeks, I rented out my apartment, sold my car, gave away my books. On November 4th, 2010, I checked in at the United Airlines counter in San Francisco with a one-way ticket to Brazil. After 21 years, I was going home. So, again, I returned back to Brazil with real expectations as a Brazilian, as somebody who cared about the place, as somebody whose entire family was there, but also as a reporter with very specific questions. And as reporters, we tend to look for measurable quantities, for specific promises that we can hold authorities accountable for. And there were a number of those, in addition to the broader expectations that came with the improved economy. The Olympics and the World Cup brought specific promises in terms of transportation infrastructure, which was a tremendous necessity. Rio has one of the worst traffic situations in the world. There are promises to increase revenue and jobs, specific promises to improve living conditions in the favelas. It's supposed to be one of the big social legacies of the Olympic Games. Security, one of the really big issues for people who live in Rio, but also for investors. With the Olympics and the oil discoveries, there were companies interested in coming to Rio, and you really think about that twice if you're a CEO and you're telling your executives that they're going to need to drive in bulletproof cars and things like that. So that's a real concern. And another very, very clear, specific promise was to clean up the pollution in Guanabara Bay, the bay at the center of Greater Rio, which is heavily polluted, has been sort of a toilet of the cities for the past few decades. So these were some of the things that I was going to be looking at, and these are some of the things that I want to talk to you about. One of the first, most obvious challenges was security. Rio, as most of you probably know, had over decades had substantial swaths of the city, favela communities that had been taken over by drug dealing gangs, largely unimpeded by government. It seemed that as long as the criminal activity did not interfere with the city at large, with the asfalto, city outside of the favelas, the police were more or less willing to not trespass those borders. And this had tremendous consequences, obviously, for the residents of favelas, as well as for everyone else. And so this is one of the things that had to be taken on. Another substantial aspect of the security question was, of course, the police itself. Police culture over decades had also devolved into it being very, very violent. And not to dismiss what police violence is here in the United States, it's also very, very serious. But the numbers, the degree of what we saw in Brazil was astonishing. In 2007, which was when Rio was chosen to host the World Cup, also Rio was preparing to host the Pan American Games, Rio State Police killed 1,330 people. These are numbers that every time I look at them, I'm astounded again. I have no idea what that was. And this language of war developed. If you look at newspaper coverage of the time and still now, this conflict between police and the gangsters was talked about as a war, which is deeply problematic because in a war, of course, you kill the enemy, you vanquish the enemy, that's the goal. And normally police work is peacekeeping. Police is supposed to arrest, bring justice, bring charges, take to court, etc. Once you start talking about a civil conflict like this in war terms, you get numbers like this, essentially. And one of the programs proposed to deal with this was the UPP program. This is the state secretary for public security. These are some of the UPP officers. UPP is Unidades de Polícia Pacificadora, pacification police units. The idea was that unlike the MO of Rio Police in dealing with favelas and dealing with gangs, which had been to push into the community, guns blazing, as if you're pushing into enemy territory, with all of the consequences that you can imagine. This program, the idea was the police was going to make an incursion into these communities, warning them in advance so that drug dealers would have the chance to leave. The idea was not to arrest the drug dealers or kill them, as had been the case in the past, but to take over the territory and implant permanent police presence there. Reclaiming, so to speak, in the language they used, this territory, and allowing permeability, allowing police to come and go and other people to come and go. This was really interesting in the sense that for decades, pretty much nothing had been done. One tiny program had been tried before, but there had been generally the state had allowed this situation to remain as it was, with tremendous consequences for the people who lived in these communities. So this was a pretty sizable program and pretty innovative for Rio. There was this, the UPP Social, a social program that was supposed to complement the policing aspect of it, with all kinds of very noble goals, fostering democratic processes, creating a positive relationship with the state, etc. And there was this other program. These are all the things that were promised, all the things that were expected, that created a lot of hope. The Monaco Diaco program means Carioca living, and this was supposed to be the Olympics' biggest social legacy, in the words of Rio's mayor, this guy right here, Eduardo Paes. And the words that he used to talk about this, the program itself was pretty revolutionary, because the idea of it was to bring what they call urbanization, meaning services, sewage treatment, running water, safe electricity, etc., to all Rio favelas by 2020. This is huge. If you think about the number of people that it affects, if you think about the fact that these communities have been there for decades, for without this would be very substantial if it were put in place. And not just for Rio, but if you think of all the other megacities in the world that have these same struggles, that also have squatter communities, if Rio were able to do something like this, it would mean something very important. And in fact, the mayor of the city got some award for this. The mayor talked about it in these very progressive terms. You know, the city needs to be socially integrated. Favelas can be the solution and not the problem. In a place that had seen in the 60s and 70s, not that long ago, massive favela removals, entire communities wiped out. This was a radical shift in the way that these communities were talked about, in addition to the services being offered. So, again, very significant, very interesting. And I put this map up here just so you have a sense of how many people would be affected by these programs if this really went into place. You're really talking about all of Rio favelas by 2020. It's a significant number of people in a significant portion of the state. But again, there were signs that things were not as they seem, and this is the journalism part of it. I came in hoping that these things would happen with high expectations of my own, and started to look into it. One of the first obvious signs was the Monaco Diaco program. There was a big international architectural competition to see who would implement these programs. All kinds of firms competed. They were selected. The communities in which they would work were selected, and then the funding just disappeared soon after the mayor's re-election. Coincidentally, after he had used this as part of his platform, it was never implemented. You still saw, ads like this. This is his campaign re-election program, and this is the Rio 2016, the Olympics. This is the Monaco Diaco. All of this was all brought together as sort of part of a package, in terms of the rhetoric, in terms of what was sold, but it never actually happened. A couple of communities that did get something that was called Monaco Diaco, these were programs that were pre-existing and that didn't have the very progressive elements that the original program had. the original program did something that had never been done in these favela urbanizations programs, which was actually survey the community members about what they wanted. Actually ask them what's important for them, if they want, a public recreation area, if they want water treatment. So this program had that aspect. It actually had sociologists and anthropologists in addition to engineers and architects. So all that was wiped out. UPP Social, that other program, was also abandoned by the government. It was passed off to an NGO, but it was no longer a state responsibility as of 2013. And all of that talk about developing a new relationship with developing a more positive relationship between these favela residents and, Rio residents in general and the state, this continued to basically be the face of the state that many favela residents saw. They continued to, the police part did go into effect, the UPP part, but not anything else in many, many communities. Over time, the number of people killed by police did improve. There was a substantial effort within police to reform culture, and there were some individuals within police that were working towards this. But after years of a downward trend, and I'm using a very crude number of people killed by police, these are the police's own statistics, but just because it's very simple and it says something very important about the police's relationship to the population. So after years of downward trend and hitting a low of 416 in 2013, so substantially lower than that 1,330 number of 2007, it started to go back up significantly in 2014. And 2015 as well has been a significant jump. And the relationship between the police and the people at large continued to be one of antagonism. This photo is of the reaction of the population after a young man was killed in Pavãozinho, a favela in Rio, and the police was suspected, and there was the usual talk of the usual blaming of the victim. He was probably involved in drugs, a drug dealer, etc. But actually, in this case, he was a dancer, and he was on a TV program, and he was well known and well liked, and obviously not involved in the things that they were saying he was involved. So there was a protest that was not just the favela residents, but this is down in Copacabana, and this is the police reacting to the people protesting this young man's death. The other very perverse aspect of what was happening around these times is, in addition to not getting those improvement programs that I talked about in the beginning, what we did see tremendously is a revamping, a bringing back of favela removals. Again, we'd had in the 60s and 70s. Favelas had been cleared out of what are now some of the highest rent neighborhoods in Rio. If you know Rio, Lagoa, Gávea, Leblon, they were removed and pushed into housing developments in what were then the far outskirts of the city. For example, the City of God, Cidade de Deus, that community, it started as a housing development that was settled by people removed from these other favelas. This map, I think, is really interesting because it shows you the logic that determined these removals, that determined what was happening. The pink dots are the places from which people are being removed, and the yellow is the housing developments. And this, if you know a little bit of Rio, well, I'll tell you that the area of Rio that has by far something like 60-something% of jobs is this area right here, the South Central area. It concentrates the greatest wealth, the greatest amount of jobs, transportation network, services of all sorts are here. This right here is the Olympic cluster in Baja. So, and Baja, the west side of Rio as it's called, is the sort of the wealthy, booming real estate frontier of Rio, area of greatest growth has been and will continue to be the kinds of investment that are happening around the Olympics. So you're seeing basically the same thing perversely that we saw in the 60s and 70s. People are being removed from the areas of greatest resources. The people with least personal resources, the most disempowered, disenfranchised people in Rio. Sorry, I don't know how that happened. So the people who need the most support are being sent furthest away, where even the cost of a bus ticket is a serious impediment to getting to work. And in the book, I follow some of these communities that were removed. One community, for example, Metro, which is right by the big soccer stadium, Maracanã in Rio. If you watch the World Cup, you watch games in there. They were removed, and what was offered to them is housing in Cosmos here. So they went from there to here. By public transportation, that was 4 hours. And so this was talked about, again, by the mayor, particularly and by the city's housing secretary, as giving people dignified living conditions. Look at how they're living, this is how they would say, and we're trying to offer them something decent, and these people must be idiots to not understand that, but if you look at the map, you see people have a logic. So there were some reactions. One of the things that was really heartening to me is that these people, because they have been historically disempowered by the system, by the infrastructure in which they live and work, it's been hard for them to push back. In the 60s, there was one favela community, Catacumba, that actually came up with their own urbanization plan and proposed it to the city and said, instead of removing us, can you please bring us services and they literally said, give us the bricks. We are construction workers. We will build houses as you think houses must be. If you allow us to stay here, it didn't work. So this community here is Vila Autódromo, right next to the Olympic Park. They've been resisting strongly. They've been very, very organized. I don't know how they do it, honestly, because even there, as a reporter, following their case, it was exhausting to be part of their meetings, to be part of their organization, because it takes time, and they have jobs, they have 2 and 3 jobs, they have long distances to cover, and it's where they live, and they've been living with this resistance, they've been living with this effort to fight removal for years now. But they're still continuing. This is one of their protests. They even created this little logo, their name. It's very, like they're on social media. They've done a tremendous job of organizing. They established a connection with the university that came up with a development plan, an urbanization plan for their community, much as Catacumba had done in the 60s. Presented it to the mayor and asked the mayor for a response, which he never gave them. So they've done an amazing job, but this is also Vila Autódromo. There were increasingly forceful negotiations, threats. All the trees in the community were cut. Power was cut. Phone was cut, and eventually you had this kind of thing. You can't see it here. It says Prefeitura do Rio Mayor's office, basically. Issue number 3, and then we'll open it up for questions. Another one in which there's very concrete set of promises, and you can follow up, was cleaning the bay. The bay, as you can see here, takes in 480 swimming pools worth of sewage per day, every day. Out of 3 times that you flush the toilet in Rio, 1 goes straight into the bay, unimproved in any way. The situation has been bad and has been getting worse in the last few decades as population grew around it. And in this case, there was a very specific promise because of the Olympic Games. There's going to be sailing competitions in the water. So they said 80% of this pollution was going to be cleaned by 2016. And, it's not just sewage, it's also trash. Because what happens is, say you've got this bay, and you've got, I think, over 20 rivers and streams that empty into it from all sides. And the communities around it, many of them have no sewage treatment at all and no garbage removal at all. And so people have no choice but to throw it into their local streams, put it in some empty lot, and then when it rains, you see this massive clearing out of trash into streams, rivers, and eventually into the bay. And so this is obviously a problem if you're talking about having a sailing competition where, if you have a boat get tangled in plastic, it could cost somebody a victory. And I had another slide in here that I took out because even before this, I was just going to say, and obviously the Olympics is the reason why we're talking about pollution in the bay now and trash in the bay now, but the consequences for the people who live around it are tremendous. It has a daily health cost for families, particularly for children. I wish I'd kept that other slide actually, because it was a picture of these kids playing soccer, and you could by a very polluted stream, you can see that there's daily interaction there, and it has a very significant cost beyond the Olympic Games. So this is again, The Economist revisited that very memorable cover. Now we've got the economy is shrinking. We're in a recession. Inflation is back up. Inflation is a huge flag for Brazilians who lived through hyperinflation in the 1980s. It was scarring, for those of us who remember it. So inflation is, I think, reaching 10% now. Unemployment is up. The president's popularity ratings are down. There's a huge corruption scandal that has been unfolding for over a year that involves politicians of both the governing Workers' Party and the opposition. It involves the oil company that is Brazil's biggest employer and was supposed to pump all that oil from that offshore rig that was supposed to bring money to education and health. So they've been gutted essentially. And the big construction companies that are directly responsible for the Olympic venues, as well as everything else that happens in Brazil. All the big infrastructural projects in Brazil are done by the same. Brazil's sort of like the U.S. is a military-industrial complex. Brazil's sort of a construction-industrial complex. They're very important. So to the economy. So we're talking about a corruption scandal and a crisis that is involving the political and economic leaders of the country. It has severely tainted this leadership. So it's a very grim moment for Brazil right now. And just to conclude, to the Economist's question of has Brazil blown it, I want to say, I did go to Brazil with this tremendous sense that this was an opportunity of the sort that doesn't come very often for a country. There was money, there was political will, it was a demographic golden moment, when you have the majority of the population is in their productive working years, before the population as a whole starts to get older, as has happened in Europe and with those consequences. So for many reasons, it was a moment for Brazil that was potentially very, very positive, and many of those things have not borne fruit. That said, I think the economists measure, I think there's more to a country than GDP and inflation rates. Brazil is a better place to live for the majority of Brazilians, particularly lower income Brazilians, than it was when I last lived there, which was in the mid to late 80s. there have been many significant improvements that are real and that go beyond, like I say, numbers. But it is a difficult moment that we're living now, and I hope that this moment of real crisis, of the investigation of all these corruption allegations, will help the country move, because this is also, to look at it in a very optimistic way, the fact that there is corruption is not necessarily so new, but the fact that there is an investigation and the country's taking this much time to look deeply into it. We're seeing politicians, we're seeing the wealthiest men in Brazil questioned and jailed. This is also revolutionary. So it's a difficult moment, but it's also a moment when things that have not happened before are happening. So it could be another positive moment. It could be another moment for growth. So that's my presentation. And just to say a little bit about the book and the relationship between what I was talking about and what I wrote. What I did here is a little bit more issue-based, and what I did in the book is really try to show what these things mean from a very on-the-ground perspective. So I spend more time with people and in places where you could see these transformations, places that were key to either the environment or the social cleansing that was happening. There was a removal of homeless people and prostitutes,